The needle pierced my arm. Cold, clinical, my brother's voice slicing through the sterile air. "Sign the contract, Sarah, or the marrow stays in your bones." My fingers trembled, but my phone was recording. The glass cabinet shattered as Julian's guard hurled my attorney into it. Blood on the floor, ink on the page, and now my last hope for a donor is gone. The pen hovers. My life or my company. No time left. The antiseptic stench of bleach stung Sarah's nostrils, competing with the metallic tang of the IV drip clicking beside her bed. Julian's polished Oxfords crunched against the linoleum. He didn't offer flowers or a forced smile. Instead, he dropped a thick stack of vellum onto her tray table, the heavy thud vibrating through her brittle ribs. "Sign it, Sarah." Julian's voice lacked its usual boardroom thunder, replaced by a terrifying, quiet precision. She traced the embossed logo of Johnson Vance Corp. Atop the first page. Her fingers, pale as the bleached sheets, trembled. "You want the CEO chair for a bag of marrow?" He leaned over the bed rail, his shadow swallowing her light. The air between them tasted of expensive espresso and cold ambition. "Think of it as a merger. Your life for your shares. My donor match is the only one in the registry. The clock is ticking on your white blood cell count, not mine." Sarah squeezed the plastic edge of her mattress. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against the monitor's steady beep. Julian's eyes remained flat, devoid of the 20 years of friendship they shared. He was calculating dividends while she withered. Under the rumpled duvet, her thumb found the tactile ridge of her smartphone. She pressed the side button 3 times. A subtle haptic buzz confirmed the recording had begun. "The board won't accept a signature under duress, Julian," Sarah whispered, her voice a dry rasp. She focused on the ceiling, counting the tiles. 1, 2, 3. The grid was the only thing holding the room together. "They'll see the timeline. They'll see the extortion." Julian let out a short, bark-like laugh. "The board sees a dying woman holding onto a steering wheel she can no longer turn. I'm the rescue boat, Sarah. Sign the papers and the procedure starts at 6 a.m. Don't sign, and I go back to my penthouse. You can spend your final hours counting those tiles. I believe there are 144 of them." Sarah's heart skipped. He knew her rituals. He was inside her head, dismantling her defenses piece by piece. She needed to keep him talking. Every word of his demand was another nail in his legal coffin. If she could just get the recording out of this room. The heavy door swished open, cutting through Julian's looming presence. James Wilson stepped inside, his brow furrowed as his gaze darted from the legal contract to Julian's coiled posture. The familiar clink-clink of peppermints against a silver tin preceded him. A small sound of hope in the sterile vacuum. "Am I interrupting a bedside vigil?" James asked, his voice dripping with practiced suspicion. He didn't wait for an answer. He walked straight to the tray table, his eyes scanning the vellum. "Julian, I hope this isn't what it looks like. Because if this is a transfer of voting rights, we have a significant problem." Julian straightened, smoothing the front of his charcoal suit. "James, always the first one to the fire. I'm simply offering Sarah a way to focus on her recovery. The company needs a steady hand, not a ghost in a hospital gown." Subverted. Sarah watched James, her pulse thrumming in her neck. This was the moment. James was a shark, a man who had spent 30 years navigating the murky waters of corporate law. He'd seen every trick in the book. If anyone could pin Julian to the wall, it was him. Sarah felt a surge of genuine hope, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fever racking her body. James wouldn't just stop the signature. He would dismantle Julian's entire leverage. "Actually," James said, pulling a folded document from his briefcase, I've already filed an emergency injunction with the New York State Supreme Court. We're challenging your status as the sole donor match, Julian. And more importantly, we're freezing your voting rights effective immediately based on a conflict of interest. You can't vote on a succession plan where you are the primary beneficiary during a medical crisis. Julian's face went pale, then a mottled, angry red. James offered a thin, peppermint-scented smile. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her shoulders dropped. The trap was set. James had moved faster than Julian anticipated. The law, her old friend, was finally stepping in to protect her. "You think a piece of paper stops me?" Julian hissed. "I think the law stops you," James countered calmly. "The board has been notified. They're meeting in an hour to review the ethics of your offer." "You're done, Julian. Leave the room." Julian looked at the door, then back at Sarah. He seemed small for the first time in years. He turned and walked toward the exit, his head down. James winked at Sarah. "We got him," he whispered. But at the threshold, Julian stopped. He didn't leave. He slowly turned back, and the anger on his face had been replaced by a terrifying, calm amusement. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his own phone. "James, you're so focused on the law that you forgot who writes the checks for the people who enforce it." Julian pressed a button. Suddenly, James's phone began to chime. Not a call, but a series of rapid-fire alerts. James pulled it out, his brow knitting together. "What is this?" "That," Julian said, "is the sound of your firm's primary credit line being pulled." "And that second sound?" "That's the notification that your lead partner just accepted a position as my personal general counsel." "He's already withdrawn the injunction, James. He's also filed a motion to have you disbarred for exploiting a mentally unstable client to further your own career." James's face drained of color. He tapped the screen frantically, but the access denied icons were popping up like digital tombstones. "He wouldn't. We've been partners for 15 years. Everyone has a price, James. Yours was just too high for me to bother paying. I bought the whole building instead." Julian stepped back into the room, his shadow growing long again. "Now, not only do I have the marrow, but I have the only man who could have saved your company. And James, you're trespassing on private property. I just bought the naming rights to this wing 10 minutes ago." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the frantic clink-clink of James's tin as his hands began to shake. Sarah felt the world tilt. The legal shield she'd counted on hadn't just cracked. It had been melted down and reforged into a cage. Julian snapped his fingers. A massive man with a neck thicker than Sarah's thigh stepped into the room. This was Michael Davis, Julian's fixer. He didn't look like a guard. He looked like a wall of meat and muscle. "Mr. Wilson is leaving," Julian said. James tried to stand his ground. "You can't do this, Julian. This is a medical facility." Michael didn't use words. He lunged forward, his movement a blur of heavy denim and brute force. He grabbed James by the lapels of his silk suit and heaved. James, a man of 55, who spent his days behind a desk, was no match. He was propelled backward, his heels skidding on the linoleum. The sound of the impact was sickening, a sharp, crystalline shatter. Michael had shoved James directly into a glass-fronted medical cabinet. The glass exploded into 1,000 glittering diamonds, raining down on James's shoulders. He slumped to the floor, a jagged shard catching the sleeve of his jacket, blood beginning to bloom like a dark rose on the white floor. "James!" Sarah screamed, her voice breaking. She tried to sit up, but the IV line yanked her back, the needle biting deep into her vein. Julian didn't even look at the injured lawyer. He was focused on the tray table. In the chaos, Sarah had seen her chance. Her hand, thin and claw-like, had darted out and snagged the predatory contract. She shoved it beneath her thin hospital pillow, the stiff vellum crinkling against the fabric. "Where is it?" Julian asked, his voice low and dangerous. He stepped over James, who was groaning and clutching his side. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah gasped, her heart rate monitor wailing a high-pitched alarm. The smell of copper from James's cut filled the small space. Julian began to toss the room. He flipped the water pitcher, spilling ice and cold liquid across the floor. He ripped the thin blanket from the foot of the bed. Sarah lay there, exposed and shivering, her ribs visible through her thin gown. She kept her head pressed hard against the pillow, her neck muscles straining. "Check him," Julian barked at Michael. The guard hauled James up by his collar and patted him down, tossing his briefcase across the room. Papers flew like wounded birds. "He doesn't have it, boss." Julian turned his gaze back to Sarah. His eyes were cold, calculating the probability of her hiding it. But then, a nurse's voice echoed from the hallway, responding to the alarm on the monitor. "Hide it," Julian whispered, straightening his tie. "But remember, Sarah, every minute you play detective is a minute your blood turns to poison. You have the document, I have the cure. Let's see which one you can live without." He signaled to Michael, who dragged the dazed James Wilson out of the room just as the door swished open. The nurse, a young woman named Linda with colorful, child-friendly glasses, rushed in. "What happened? I heard glass." Sarah lay back, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. She could feel the hard edge of the contract beneath her skull. He tripped," she lied, her voice a ghost of itself. "It was an accident." Linda looked at the shattered cabinet, then at the spilled water, her eyes wide with a suspicion she was too afraid to voice. I'll get the janitor, and we need to check your vitals. You're redlining, Sarah." As Linda bustled about, clearing the glass with a broom that made a lonely, scratching sound, James managed to slip back to the doorway. He looked haggard, a smear of blood on his cheek, his tie hanging limp. He waited until Linda was in the bathroom fetching a mop before he leaned in. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I just got a call from our contact in Ohio. The backup donor, the one we spent 3 months vetting." Sarah felt a cold dread wash over her. "What, James?" "He's gone. Julian paid him off. $500,000 to take a vacation in the South Pacific where he can't be reached by phone or mail. He signed a non-compete for his own marrow." James slumped against the doorframe, the clink-clink of his mint tin sounding like a funeral bell. "We're isolated. There is no one else. Julian is the only match left on the planet." The weight of the words hit Sarah harder than any physical blow. She was in a room filled with high-tech machinery, in the heart of the greatest city in the world, surrounded by people whose job was to save her. And yet, she was more alone than a sailor lost at sea. The grid of the ceiling tiles blurred as tears finally pricked her eyes. 144. A perfect square. A perfect cage. The next morning brought no relief, only the relentless ticking of the corporate clock. Julian hadn't just stayed the course, he had accelerated it. "He moved the board meeting," James said, pacing the small square of linoleum that wasn't covered in medical equipment. He looked like he hadn't slept in 48 hours. His eyes were bloodshot, and his peppermint tin was nearly empty, the rhythmic clink now hollow and desperate. 24 hours. It's happening tomorrow morning at 9. He's claiming emergency circumstances due to your declining health." Sarah tried to sit up. The room felt like it was spinning, a carousel of white walls and chrome. He's trying to bury me before I'm dead. I need to talk to the board, James. Set up the video link, now. James scrambled for his laptop, his fingers fumbling with the silver cables. I'm trying. But the hospital Wi-Fi is acting up. It's like there's a wall around this room. Sarah watched the screen. The loading circle spun, a mocking, endless loop. It's not the Wi-Fi, James. It's Julian. He's jamming us. I'll use my hotspot, James muttered, his jaw set. He tapped at his phone, his face bathed in the blue light of the screen. There, I'm in, connecting to the boardroom. Sarah, I see them. Robert Chen is there. He's straightening the pens on the table. You know how he is. Sarah leaned toward the camera, trying to pull a mask of professional competence over her haggard face. She could see the board members, a row of gray suits in a mahogany-paneled room 3 miles away. Robert Chen, the aligner, was indeed obsessively adjusting his notepad so it was perfectly parallel to the edge of the table. Robert, Sarah croaked, her voice barely a whisper. Can you hear me? On the screen, Robert looked up, his eyes searching the room. But he didn't look at the camera. He looked at the speakers. Is someone there? We have a buzzing sound on the line. Robert, it's Sarah. I'm here. Julian is... Suddenly, the screen flickered. A jagged line of static tore through the image of the boardroom. The audio dissolved into a high-pitched whine that made Sarah wince, the sound vibrating through her teeth. Connection lost. James groaned, slamming his fist against the tray table. He's cutting the signal every time you try to speak. He's letting me see them, but he's not letting them hear you. To them, you're just a frozen image of a dying woman. Sarah sank back into the pillows. The air in the room felt heavy, as if the oxygen itself was being rationed. She reached for the plastic mask of her oxygen tank, needing a deep pull of the life-giving gas. She turned the valve, expecting the familiar hiss. Nothing. She turned it further. A tiny, pathetic wheeze escaped the tube. She looked at the gauge. It was barely cracked open, the needle hovering near zero. Someone had tampered with the regulator. James, she gasped, clutching her chest. The tank. It's closed. James lunged for the tank, his fingers frantic as he twisted the metal knob back to full. The hiss returned, a cold rush of air filling Sarah's lungs. She breathed in greedily, the scent of rubber and concentrated oxygen clearing the fog in her brain for a moment. He's trying to suffocate me, she whispered. Look at this, James said, his voice trembling. He walked over to a large bouquet of lilies that had been delivered an hour ago. The flowers were beautiful, but their scent was cloying, like a funeral parlor. He reached into the center of the white petals and pulled out a small, black plastic disc. A microphone. He's been listening to every word. Sarah felt a cold shiver crawl down her spine. The room wasn't a sanctuary. It was a laboratory, and she was the specimen. Julian was watching her struggle, measuring her breaths, waiting for the precise moment her will would break. The door opened, and a man in a blue orderly's uniform pushed a cart inside. He was tall, his face obscured by a surgical mask and a low-slung cap. He didn't look at Sarah or James. He just started fiddling with the IV pump. I didn't call for a change, Sarah said, her voice sharp with newfound paranoia. Routine maintenance, ma'am, the orderly said. His voice was flat, muffled by the mask. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a syringe filled with a clear, viscous liquid. He moved toward the port in Sarah's IV line. Wait, James said, stepping forward. What is that? That's not on her chart. Doctor's orders, the orderly grunted. He didn't slow down. His movements were too practiced, too aggressive for a simple maintenance check. Sarah saw the way he gripped the syringe, not with the delicate touch of a healer, but with the white-knuckled intensity of an attacker. Her instincts, honed in 100 boardroom battles, screamed at her. "No," she yelled. She reached for the heavy ceramic water pitcher on her bedside table. It was full of ice and water, weighing at least 5 pounds. As the orderly lunged for her arm, Sarah swung the pitcher with every ounce of strength her wasted muscles could muster. The impact was a dull thud as the base of the pitcher caught the man on the side of his head. Water exploded everywhere, drenching the bed and the floor. The orderly stumbled back, the syringe flying from his hand and shattering against the wall. He let out a muffled curse, clutching his ear. James grabbed a heavy medical dictionary and brandished it like a club. "Get out, I'm calling security." The fake orderly didn't stay to fight. He scrambled for the door, slipping on the wet floor before regaining his footing and disappearing into the hallway. Sarah fell back against the soaked pillows, her chest heaving, her heart hammering like a trapped bird. The exertion had cost her everything. The world began to gray at the edges. "Sarah, stay with me." James was over her, his hands shaking as he tried to dry her face with a thin towel. The door opened again, but this time it was Dr. Miller. He didn't rush to Sarah's side. He stood at the foot of the bed, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his pristine white lab coat. He looked at the mess, the broken syringe, and the terrified woman in the bed with a clinical, detached coldness. "What is going on here?" Miller asked. "An assassin just tried to drug her," James shouted. "Where is the security you promised?" Miller didn't look at James. He looked at Sarah's chart. "You're hallucinating, Sarah. The stress of the leukemia is causing acute paranoia. I've seen it before in late-stage patients." "I hit him, Miller," Sarah rasped. "There is water everywhere. Look at the floor." "I see a spilled pitcher, Sarah. I see a patient who is becoming a danger to herself and the staff." Miller pulled a document from his pocket. "Which is why I've just signed this. It's a medical affidavit declaring you mentally incompetent to handle your own affairs. Your brother will be assuming power of attorney as of now." Sarah felt the last of her strength evaporate. The betrayal was complete. The man she had trusted to heal her had just handed the keys to her kingdom to the man trying to kill her. "How much?" Sarah whispered. "How much did he pay you?" Miller finally looked at her. For a split second, she saw a flicker of the janitor's son, who was still ashamed of his past. But then his eyes turned back to stone. "It's not about the money, Sarah. It's about the research. Julian is funding a new wing, a legacy that will save thousands. You're just one patient. The math is simple." He turned and walked out, the sound of the door closing feeling like the lid of a coffin being hammered shut. James sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. "We're done. The law, the medicine. He bought it all." Sarah looked at the ceiling. 144 tiles. She realized she had been playing by the rules of a game that had been rigged from the start. She had been trying to win a merger while Julian was fighting a war. "James," she said, her voice taking on a new, cold clarity. "Stop the filings. Stop the phone calls to the board." James looked up, confused. "What? We can't just give up." "We're not giving up," Sarah said. She looked at her trembling hands, then balled them into fists. "We're going scorched earth. If Julian wants to burn this company down to own the ashes, then I'm going to make sure he's standing in the middle of the fire. No more rules, James. No more proposals. We're going to survive." The peppermint fixer, looked at his client, and for the first time in days, he saw the CEO again. He nodded slowly, the clink-clink of his tin echoing one last time before he tucked it away. The war had truly begun. By nightfall, the hospital had transformed. The oncology wing, usually a place of hushed whispers and soft-soled shoes, now felt like a military installation. Julian's private security team, led by the silent, humming Michael Davis, had replaced the standard night staff. The friendly faces Sarah had come to know were gone, replaced by men with earpieces and cold, vacant stares. "They took my laptop," James whispered, leaning close to Sarah's ear. He was sitting in the corner, his silk tie finely removed, his shirt sleeves rolled up. "And they've blocked the cell signal for the entire floor. We're in a vacuum, Sarah." Sarah didn't respond. She was watching the glass partition that separated her room from the hallway. Michael Davis stood there, his massive arms crossed over his chest. He was humming, a low, vibrating drone that seemed to rattle the very bones in Sarah's head. It was a funeral dirge, a wall of sound that told her she was already dead to the world. A soft knock at the door broke the tension. It wasn't one of the guards. It was Nurse Linda. She looked terrified, her colorful glasses sliding down her nose. She was carrying a meal tray, but her hands were shaking so hard the plastic dome over the plate was rattling. "Dinner, you know," she said, her voice barely audible. Michael Davis stepped into the doorway, his humming stopping abruptly. He looked at the tray, his eyes scanning the mashed potatoes and the small cup of lime jello. "Leave it and go." I have to check her IV, you know," Linda squeaked. Michael stared at her for a long beat, then stepped back. Linda scurried into the room. She set the tray down on the table and leaned over Sarah, ostensibly to check the bandage on her arm. "Under the jello," she whispered, her breath smelling of coffee and anxiety. "Don't let them see, you know." Sarah's heart leapt. As Linda moved away, Sarah slid her hand under the cool plastic of the tray. Her fingers brushed against something hard and rectangular, a satellite phone. "Thank you," Sarah mouthed. Linda gave a quick, jerky nod and practically ran out of the room. Sarah waited until Michael Davis had resumed his position and his humming began again. She slid the phone under her leg, the cold plastic biting into her skin. "James," she hissed, "I have a phone." James's eyes widened. He moved to block the view from the glass partition, using his body as a shield. Sarah pulled the phone out. It was a rugged, bulky thing with a long antenna. She powered it on, the screen glowing like a beacon in the darkened room. She didn't call the board. She didn't call the police. She knew Julian had those bases covered. She dialed the one number she had memorized as a child, the direct line to the city's largest news desk. If she couldn't win in the boardroom, she would win in the court of public opinion. The phone rang. Once, twice. "News 4. What's your tip?" A voice crackled through the static. "My name is Sarah Johnson. I'm the CEO of Johnson Vance Corp. I'm being held against my will at Mount Sinai." The door didn't just open. It exploded inward. Julian was there. He wasn't the polished executive anymore. His hair was disheveled, his eyes wild with a predatory fury. He had been monitoring the unauthorized signal from a laptop in the hallway. "Give it to me," he roared. He lunged across the bed. Sarah tried to pull the phone away, but she was too weak. Julian's hands, large and cold, clamped down on her wrists. He pinned her to the mattress, the weight of his body crushing the air from her lungs. "You think you're so smart, Sarah." Julian spat, his face inches from hers. The smell of expensive scotch and desperation rolled off him. You think you can play the hero? He wrenched the phone from her hand, his thumb digging into the bruise on her forearm where the IV had been. Sarah let out a cry of pain. "Look at you," Julian mocked, holding the phone up like a trophy. "You're a ghost, Sarah. You're a memory. I've already told the world you're gone." He leaned down, his voice a terrifying whisper that cut through the sound of the heart monitor's frantic beeping. "You'll be dead by sunrise without my marrow. And the best part? No one will even know you're missing. I've already drafted the press release." Sarah Johnson passes away peacefully in her sleep. It's a very touching tribute. He stood up, straightening his jacket. He looked at Michael Davis. "Lock it down. No one in, no one out, not even the nurses." As Julian walked out, James lunged for the door, but Michael Davis caught him with a single hand to the chest, throwing him back into the room like a rag doll. The heavy electronic lock clicked into place, a sound of finality that echoed through the room. 10 minutes later, a crackle came over the room's emergency intercom. It wasn't the nurse's station. It was James's voice, but it sounded distant, distorted. He must have found a way to patch into the system from the small terminal in the corner of the room. "Sarah, can you hear me?" "James, where are you?" "I'm still in the room, Sarah. I'm just using the internal line. I just got a message through on my watch, a text from my assistant. Julian did it. He showed the board a forged death certificate. They've already held the vote. He's the new CEO. The company is his." Sarah lay in the dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the Manhattan skyline. She was a billionaire who couldn't buy a glass of water. She was a leader of thousands who couldn't command a single person to open a door. "I have the recording, James," she whispered to the empty room. "I have the proof of what he did." She reached under her pillow and felt the hard ridge of the smartphone she'd used to record Julian's first visit. It was still there, her only weapon. "It doesn't matter, Sarah." James's voice came back, sounding defeated. "There's no Wi-Fi, no cell service, no way to get that file to anyone who matters. We're buried alive." Subverted. Sarah felt a cold, hard knot of determination form in her gut. She wasn't dead yet. She looked at the smartphone. It was a masterpiece of engineering, a device that could broadcast to the entire world. If only it had a signal. But she didn't need the world. She just needed the people in this building. "James," she said, her voice gaining strength. "The hospital has an internal server for the medical records. If I can get this phone to talk to that server, I can broadcast the file to every screen in the building, every nurse's station, every waiting room, every doctor's tablet." "How?" James asked. "The Wi-Fi is cut." "The Wi-Fi is cut for us," Sarah said, her mind racing through the technical specs of the wing she had helped fund. "But the emergency systems have their own dedicated line. It's hardwired. If I can get to the junction box in the hallway." "Sarah, you can't even stand up," James reminded her gently. "Then I'll crawl," she said. She sat up, the movement sending a wave of nausea through her. She swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her feet hit the cold floor, and she nearly collapsed. She grabbed the IV pole, using it as a crutch. She made it to the door. She looked through the glass. Michael Davis was gone, likely conferring with Julian down the hall. This was her chance. She reached for the handle. It didn't move. The electronic lock was red. "James, I need the code," she whispered. "I don't have it, Sarah. It's a rolling encryption." Sarah leaned her forehead against the cool glass. She looked at the smartphone in her hand. This was it, the final move. She had the evidence. She had the plan. She just needed 1 second of connection. She pressed the phone against the electronic lock, hoping the NFC chip might trigger a bypass, a trick she'd seen in a dozen tech journals. She held her breath as the phone's screen flickered. A green light flashed on the door. "It worked," James hissed. The door clicked open. Sarah stepped into the hallway, her heart soaring. She was out. She was going to win. She could see the junction box just 10 feet away, a small metal panel set into the wall. She just had to reach it, plug in the phone, and the truth would be out. She reached the box. Her fingers fumbled with the latch. It swung open, revealing a glowing array of fiber optic cables and ports. She took the charging cable from her pocket, the one she'd kept hidden, and plugged one end into the phone and the other into the hospital's main data port. "Uploading," she whispered, watching the progress bar. 10%, 20%, 40%. The bar hit 99% and stopped. A hand, cold and heavy, landed on her shoulder. Sarah turned. It wasn't Michael Davis. It was Julian. He wasn't angry. He was smiling. That warm, predatory smile that never reached his eyes. "I was wondering when you'd try the junction box," Julian said. He reached out and gently unplugged the phone. "I designed the security for this floor, Sarah. Did you really think I'd leave the emergency line open?" He held the phone up. "You just gave me exactly what I needed. You didn't broadcast the file to the hospital. You broadcasted it to a private server I set up an hour ago. And because you used your own credentials to bypass the lock, you've just provided digital evidence of your own mental instability. Attempting to sabotage hospital systems? That's an automatic 72-hour psychiatric hold." Sarah felt the floor disappear beneath her. She hadn't escaped. She had walked right into the heart of his trap. "Take her back to the room," Julian said to the two guards who appeared behind him. "And this time, use the restraints. We wouldn't want her hurting herself before the accident happens." As they dragged her back, Sarah saw the screen on the junction box. It wasn't showing an upload. It was showing a delete command. Her recording, her only proof, her only weapon, was being erased, bit by bit, until there was nothing left but static. The sun had set, and the room was bathed in the eerie blue-gray light of the Manhattan skyline. Sarah lay strapped to the bed, the leather restraints biting into her thin wrists. Julian stood by the window, a glass of vintage champagne in his hand. He looked like a king surveying his kingdom. "It's almost time, Sarah," he said, checking his gold watch. "The board has already ratified the transition. By tomorrow morning, Johnson Vance will be mine. And you'll be a tragic footnote in the company history." He took a sip of the champagne, the bubbles hissing in the quiet room. "I'm almost sorry it had to end this way. But you were always too focused on the numbers. You forgot that the world is run by people, and people can be bought." Sarah didn't look at him. She was looking at the thermostat on the wall. It was a small digital screen, glowing softly. She remembered a detail from the hospital's construction, a flaw in the climate control system that the engineers had never quite fixed. If the temperature in 3 adjacent rooms was raised to 95 degrees simultaneously, it triggered a thermal emergency that automatically overrode every electronic lock in the wing for fire safety. She couldn't reach the thermostat, but she could reach the call button. She pressed it, not once, but in a rhythmic 3-pop sequence. Linda appeared at the glass partition. She looked at Julian, then at Sarah. Sarah gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod toward the thermostat. Linda hesitated. She looked at the guards, and then back at Sarah. She reached out and tapped the screen on the wall outside the room. Then she moved to the next room, and the next. Suddenly, a klaxon began to wail. A deep, chest-rattling sound that drowned out Julian's champagne toast. The lights in the hallway turned a pulsing, angry red. Lick. The restraints on Sarah's bed, controlled by the same emergency system, snapped open. The door to her room slid wide. "What is this?" Julian shouted, dropping his glass. The crystal shattered on the floor, the champagne soaking into the rug. Sarah didn't wait. She rolled out of the bed, her feet hitting the floor with a heavy thud. She didn't head for the door. She headed for the nurse's station just outside. She grabbed the emergency PA microphone. "Julian," she whispered into the mic, her voice amplified until it shook the windows of the entire oncology wing. "You forgot one thing. I didn't just record you on my phone." She pressed a button on the console. Suddenly, the speakers throughout the hospital and the bridge line still open to the board members' phones erupted with sound. It wasn't the recording from her phone. It was the audio from the hidden microphone Julian had placed in the lilies. James had found a way to bridge the two systems. Julian's voice filled the air, cold, mocking, and crystalline. "You'll be dead by sunrise without my marrow. I've already told the world you're gone. I've already drafted the press release." The silence that followed was absolute. Julian stood in the middle of the room, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. The elevator doors at the end of the hall opened. It wasn't more security. It was the police, led by a man in a dark suit who looked very much like a federal prosecutor. And behind them, a young man in a flannel shirt, looking confused and holding a medical cooler. "Mr. Johnson?" the officer said, stepping into the room. "We have a warrant for your arrest. Medical coercion, attempted murder, and corporate fraud." Julian tried to speak, but no sound came out. He looked at the young man with the cooler. Who are you?" "I'm the donor from Ohio," the man said, his voice echoing in the quiet hall. "Mr. Wilson's assistant found me at the airport. He told me what you were doing. I don't want your money. I want to help her." Sarah watched as the handcuffs clicked into place around Julian's wrists. Her brother, the man who had tried to steal her life and her soul, looked small. He looked like a child caught in a lie. "You lost, Julian," Sarah said, her voice steady for the first time in weeks. "The math finally caught up to you." 2 weeks later, the New York sun felt warm on Sarah's face as she sat in a wheelchair outside the main entrance of Mount Sinai. She was thin, her hair gone from the final round of treatment, but her eyes were clear. James Wilson sat on a stone bench beside her. He looked older, his silk tie replaced by a comfortable sweater. He held a stack of papers in his lap. "The dissolution is complete," James said. "Johnson Vance is no more. The assets have been liquidated, the pensions secured. You're a private citizen, Sarah." Sarah looked out at the bustling traffic of Manhattan. The noise, the chaos, the endless movement of the city that once belonged to her. She felt light. "How much is left?" she asked. "After the legal fees and the donations to the hospital?" "Nothing," James said. "You're penniless, Sarah." Sarah took a deep breath of the city air. It didn't smell like bleach. It smelled like hot asphalt, roasted nuts, and life. "Good," she said. She stood up, her legs shaky but holding. She didn't need a wheelchair. She didn't need a grid. She looked at the sidewalk, a messy, uneven stretch of concrete that didn't follow any pattern. She took a step, then another. "Where are you going?" James asked, standing up to follow her. Sarah didn't look back. She just kept walking, merging into the crowd of strangers, a woman with no empire, no crown, and a second chance at a soul. I'm going to live, James, she said. I think I'll start with that. The counting CEO was gone. In her place, a woman walked into the sun, and for the first time in 34 years, she didn't count a single thing.